Hi, my name's Dan Keane. I'm a composer, producer, and musician based in London. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this second episode of my series, The Basics, we're going to be looking to talk about compression, specifically how to use it tastefully within your scores and tracks, but also giving you some tips and tricks for instinctively knowing what settings to reach for before opening a plugin. Now, if you haven't seen episode 1, The Basics is designed for people right at the very, very beginning of their music making journey. And I think it's important to break down those barriers to entry because often it's quite alienating when people talk about certain terms or equipment or plugins. It's quite difficult to know where to start with these things. So I want to break down that barrier to entry. The other thing is I quite like talking about concepts and thinking of new philosophies. And so whether you're right at the very start or you're a seasoned veteran of music making, I hope you take something away with you, or at least just think about something in a slightly different way. The best way, I think, to demonstrate compression is actually to give you a real-life example. And so I've recorded a project badly on purpose, each part badly in a different way to try and use compression to fix our musical issues. And I've actually linked them down below as stems. So if you want to do this along with me, whip up a project in whatever software you use with whatever suite of plugins and set it to 112 BPM and join me on there, and I'm going to show you the project now. So here's our project. We've got 4 elements here that I've stemmed together. The first here is a bass guitar. You can see particular transients here that are much louder than others. We'll be looking to smooth those out. Then we've got some drums here. And I deliberately mixed the snare drum to be far too loud, so you can really see those peaks there. We're going to look to even those out a little bit, but talking about the timbral shifts that come with that as well. Then we've got piano. Now, the piano already sounds quite nice, but I wanted to include it because I think people often kind of overdo compression. It sounds a little bit too choked, so I'm going to show you how I think about those types of things. And then finally, we've got these string evolutions. This is the Olafur Arnolds Evolutions by Spitfire Audio. And when we combine all of those elements together, we get this. So I've got this in an 8-bar loop, which will slowly drive you insane, but I thought it was important to have something that you could have kind of looping around if you want to get something just right. Also, this isn't pre-mixed, so I just normalized all of the elements straight out of Logic. So we're going to need to do a little bit of tweaking afterwards, but I'd recommend going through bit by bit, working on the compression of each element in solo, and then we will combine it together and see how it sounds. So the first thing to say is that I think compression should be used to sculpt sound in a way that aids internal balance, the relationship between elements within a track. And this control over dynamic range will then aid external balance, the balance between multiple tracks together. So that's the clincher. There are 2 things to think about with compression: dynamic range, which is the obvious one, between the quietest and the loudest peaks, and timbre, what I refer to as the internal balance. So I'm going to be using the FabFilter Pro C2 for this video. To be honest, the main reason I'm using this is because it's very good for demonstrating what's actually happening within the compressor, but it is a very good plugin all the same. But you can do all of this with stock plugins. There are a few extra features within this one, but for the most part, any compressor that you use will do the job fine. So the first thing to look at here is the threshold knob. This is the number at which your signal begins to be kind of compressed. So if I pull this down, basically everything is going to be compressed. You can see without changing any other settings that we've already got a sound that's quite nice, and the amount that it's compressed by is controlled by this ratio. So at 1:1, basically no compression is happening at all. With a ratio of 2:1, this is relatively gentle. For every dB that it exceeds the threshold, it gets cut in half. So for example, if it goes 2 dB over that threshold, it will actually only be pulled back by 1 dB of reduction. For the most part, I'd like to keep it somewhere between ratio of 2:1 and 4-1 for the most part, unless I'm doing something quite specific, in which case I might want it to be quite a lot stronger than that. I find that that gives me the most natural sound. The attack and release knobs control how quickly or how slowly the compressor acts and then lets go of the signal. Let's start with the attack. So without changing the release, you can see that suddenly we've got a really kind of lazy looking curve. Whereas with this, we've now got a lot more detail in there. Now it's worth saying that if it's going to react more slowly to this signal crossing this threshold, we might find that with a slower attack, we actually get more punch because those initial transients are crossing over the threshold before the compressor has time to pull it back. So in a lot of cases for bass guitars, I'd recommend setting it anywhere between 3 milliseconds and 10 milliseconds, depending on how much reduction you want to have, if you want it to be really punchy or a little bit more controlled. You'll often find a sweet spot that just works for you. And with release, it's a similar story, but it's on the tail end of this. Now, at this longer release, it's not very useful for us because by the time the next note plays, the compressor is still reacting to the last note we were playing. So depending on what the source material is here, you'd want to keep that release relatively short, somewhere, I reckon, around here. Something to consider with release is if you've got a very fast release, you're going to hear the sustain of a note come back much more quickly. So the transient hits and then the release is quite short, so the compressor comes back. Suddenly we've got a lot more sustain. If I only wanted a very punchy sound, I may be tempted to go for a slower release because this would allow the compressor to react so slowly that in fact you don't actually get back to zero gain reduction before the next note hits. Does that make sense? So if I start here with a slow release, quite punchy. But if I bring this release down, we're getting much more sustained. It's like do, do, do. Whereas before it was all like dum, dum, dum. All of this is made a lot more extreme by pulling the threshold down massively so you can really hear what's going on. So let's just do the same thing throughout the rest of this. I'm going to be a little bit quicker now because we've already kind of discussed the principles there, but we've got quite loud snare drums to deal with now. So in a similar way, I'm going to bring down the threshold quite massively. Did you notice then that you could actually hear the room really loudly? So that's worth thinking about as well. Do you want it to have a very roomy sound? Do you want it to sound a little bit more contained? Things like that. Always worth thinking about. So let's pull down this threshold again and let's start with the attack. So you can see that with an attack of 100 milliseconds or something like that, we're not really getting control over the elements that we're looking at. Really, we're just it's just reacting very slowly. So it's worth kind of pulling this back a little bit and finding the sweet spot. I quite like it around here. We're getting a lot of the transients coming through. Sounds really punchy, but also at the moment we've got a release of 200 milliseconds, so it's relatively slow. But let's just dial in this attack a little bit more. So with drums, it's key to look at, if you have a fast attack, you're going to lose some of the punch because the transients aren't going to work their way through before the compressor hits. But with a slower attack, we're not going to have quite so much control over our sound. So it's worth finding something in the middle. For me, I think around the 50 millisecond mark sounds good. Now, as I mentioned before with the bass guitar, if we have a longer release, we're actually going to lose some of the sustain. So have a listen to the room, not the actual drums, but the room reflections. So we can suddenly hear a lot more of the room with a shorter release. So this is also worth thinking about. Do we want it to have this kind of bloom after the fact, or do we actually want it to sound a little bit more focused, a little bit tighter? I quite like the attitude and the punch of the room reflections, so I'm setting my release here at around 150 milliseconds. I'm just noticing with these fills, we're not actually getting back to zero quickly enough, so I'm going to pull it down a little bit faster. So here it is without and then with. Might be overdoing that slightly, I'm just going to pull down the threshold. Now if I just quickly play this 4-bar section here, I'm going to the ride cymbal, but have a listen to the way the cymbals react to a slower or faster release. So with a slower release, we hear more of the wash of the cymbals, whereas with a faster release, we're hearing much more of those transients. Moving down to the piano now, same way, I'm just going to open up the Pro C2, and here we go. Now, for me, I actually want to hear the transients because I know what's coming with the strings. So I'm going to start with a slightly longer release and a slightly faster attack. So I can hear the punch of that transient coming through, but then I lose some of that sustain. And this helps to bring out the thud of the key bed, the hammers hitting the strings, things like that. I think that sounds quite balanced already. Now I'm going to move on to the strings now because there isn't really too much to say about these, except you can see that they come up really, really loudly. And while that sounds nice, I just want it more to be kind of a bed of sound. So I'm going to be quite gentle with it, but I want to make sure that we are kind of combing over those dynamic peaks. Okay, so right away, it's far too detailed. We want this to be a nice smooth overlap. So let's turn up the attack. So really, I'm just looking at the lines here, but it's worth listening to. If you hear it kind of jittering a little bit, you might want to pull that back. So I've set my attack here at about 100 milliseconds and my release at 365. I'm compressing about 3 dB, so not too much, but it's just enough to kind of give it that nice kind of breath. Now I'm going to turn down the ratio for this one. I'm going to set it to about 2.5. Really don't want it to be too kind of over the top. In fact, with this, we can actually listen to what we're getting. So it's just the very top of that bloom. So if we listen to everything now in context, how do we do? So if I just compare with and then without the compression, here's without. So it's subtle, but I hope you can hear the effect that each of those little 1% makes. I'm just going to do a quick mix now. I'm going to start with the drums. That's the kind of loudest thing. Now, it might be worth then doing a little bit of compression on your master bus. I'm just going to add one final compressor, and I don't want to do too much to it because we've already compressed every element. I just want to give it a little bit of a kind of glue. So let's try this again. So everything is sitting together quite nicely. It sounds really nice now. And I think with mix bus compression, it's about just kind of controlling the amalgam of all those things together. So when a particular snare drum hits, it's going to affect the dynamic range of all these other elements as well. It's worth saying that you really don't want to overdo these types of things. You want to be really kind of sparing. But as hopefully you can see, those little 1% really do build up. Anyway, I hope you found this video to be useful. If you did, please click thumbs up and subscribe. If you haven't done already, ding that little notification bell. Is that something you guys do? Thank you so much for watching. And yeah, I'll see you again very, very soon. Goodbye.